Şimdi sahneye Uluslararası Sürdürülebilir Yapılı Çevre Girişimi Direktörü Sayın Nils Larsson'u davet edeceğim. Kendisi bizlere iklim değişikliği, SBE Konferans serisi ve gelecek yıl Türkiye'de düzenlenecek konferans hakkında bilgiler verecek.
Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Hello. It's a very hard act to follow, that singing group. I hope I don't disappoint you too much after them. They were wonderful. Distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues, I'm here to tell you a bit about the series of conferences called SBE conferences, with a little introduction about climate change. Some of you, I'm sure, know a lot about climate change, and perhaps some of you are even sick of hearing about it, but I think it's my duty to bring out some of these things and remind you, because that's what's really motivating what we do in our group and this series also. There. First of all, ISBE, the organization that I am executive director of, is an international nonprofit. Most of our members are academics and researchers in universities and research institutes. We are interested in projects, but also kind of policy and information issues. We have local chapters. Luis Bragança in Portugal is president. All this sounds very impressive, but it's a tiny organization. It's a network more than an organization. So we have to be very careful with our what we do and how we spend our time. And one of the times we do spend is very much on climate change issues and initiatives related to that. Now, climate change issues really are pushed by greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have resource consumption as another major issue. And really, both of these are driven by issues of efficiency and consumption. Efficiency of systems and buildings and so on is something that's very important and is really on a good track. We are making our buildings more efficient. We are making our equipment more efficient, our cars more efficient, etc. And I heard this morning IMSAD is more efficient also, which is good to hear. I'm very impressed. You know, the stuff you guys do is very impressive. But the other major problem is resource consumption driven by consumption and non-renewable resource consumption. And really we're talking there about things like urban sprawl, using too much land, which cuts down on agricultural land. Buildings that are too big or not needed. We can all think of some very large buildings that are not needed at all, but were built anyway. And then there are buildings that have spaces that are too big. I mean, this gets a little more detailed now, or equipment that's not needed. Air conditioning in places where natural ventilation is really quite good enough. And then we have also issues of occupancy. One of our speakers this morning spoke about luxury flats in Istanbul which are not occupied for many months. And that happens in London too, as I think we all know who read the newspapers. And that's an enormous investment in capital, and it's wasted. Anyway, that's really enough of an introduction of what I think are the main big issues. This is greenhouse gas. And it's in many sectors, as you can see. And here are the components: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. But I've put black boxes around the things that are linked to the built environment sector, just to indicate that our sector is involved in many issues across this, because it's not only the buildings, it's the locational issues, which means transport and so on. If you look at global CO2 emissions in 1990, in industrialized countries, there was 69% of the total, and developing countries, 31%. Now, closer to where we are now, you can see the developing countries are coming up: India, China, but not just India and China, Indonesia as well. And I'm not sure if Turkey was ever called a developing country in the recent past, but I think you're really on the you're on the margins, really. Parts of Turkey are developing, parts are very well developed. So this is a problem, of course, and we have countries where people want a bigger flat, where people want to live by themselves. That was also mentioned this morning. They want to have a car, etc., etc. So, of course, we in the developed world tell them, no, you can't do that. We did that, and look at what happened. And, of course, that argument does not go very far. So we have to then, from the developed countries, and Turkey, which is very active in efficient production of equipment and materials, we have to help developing countries do it in a more efficient way. They're going to do it anyway, whether we say no, it doesn't matter. They will do it, but let's help them do it in a very efficient way. But let's also tell them, please think about waste and resource consumption levels, because that is something. The trouble with efficiency is easy, you can do it in regulations. Consumption levels is much softer and more amorphous. You can't pass regulations about consumption levels except for the most simple-minded ones. Now, what are some of the effects of greenhouse gas emissions? I have, and I'm guilty, I plead guilty, resource consumption. I have a house in the countryside in southwest France. The only excuse I can make is we go there once each summer, and we don't go back and forth each weekend like most Canadians do to their cottages. But that summer of 2003, I was in the river up to my neck, because that was called le canicule. It was the heat wave that killed, and you can see some of the temperature distributions there. 15,000 people, mainly old people, died in Paris. They were living on the third floor of some very nice houses and flats. Their children were away in the countryside somewhere. They were old. They didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have insulation. We're going to see this again. And one thing that some people didn't think about at the time was that the high temperatures also reduced the water flow for hydroelectric production and for nuclear plant cooling. So the power needed to power the air conditioning diminished, the capacity to do that. Now, IPCC, as you probably know, International Climate Change, International Panel on Climate Change. They have AR5 is the latest report, a couple of years ago. They have scenarios for how the world will develop, and they can then project global temperatures according to those scenarios. This one, as I remember, 2.6, is a kind of moderate but development-oriented scenario. And you can see here that for 2081 to 2100, the temperature changes are not drastic. But here's another scenario, 8.5, and you can see that is to a level where not only do air conditioning demands go up, crops start failing, hydroelectric production goes down, etc. There's the trouble with this business of climate change, it's all interlinked, and you can't really unhook these things. I found some things for Turkey here in UNDP, and again, it's kind of gentle at the beginning, but towards the end of this century, it gets fairly aggressive temperature increases. The precipitation, it's not a huge change, except that the south of Turkey gets less as we go through the century, and the northern part gets more. Now, the implications, the actual on-the-ground effects of this are, of course, some extreme weather events with catastrophic losses, some of which are insured. And less of them will be insured in the future because the insurance companies are not stupid. They don't want to be in a position where they are going bankrupt. Impact on disasters. Here's another reference I found with Turkey showing the likely to experience the greatest increase in climate extremes by the end of the 21st century. I'd like to know more about the situation for Turkey. I haven't found many Turkey-specific climate change reports, but it seems to me that there are some contradicting indications here. There are health issues everywhere. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with how WHO, the World Health Organization, looks at health, but they have a system they call DAILY, Disability Adjusted Life Years. And so if you die, well, that's a full that's a full count. If you have a limp only, it's a small part of it. And if you're a paraplegic, it's a bigger part, and so on. I'm not sure of the exact gradation, but as conceptually, it's something that makes sense. And you can see here that the African region, of course, has high daily count. Also the Eastern Mediterranean. And that is, contrast that with developed countries, quite low. So you can see the Eastern Med, of which I think you count yourself part of, is fairly high regime of disability-adjusted life years. What are some of the economic impacts in the building sector likely to be? We're going to require more capital investments to meet conditions of higher temperature, precipitation, and wind regimes, which is very variable. One climate researcher I heard referred to this as not climate change, but climate chaos, which is a pretty good way of looking at it. We'll have added demand for repair and upgrading of existing buildings. That will lead to more activity in the construction sector, which of course is good for work, but it also will increase demand for low-risk land, materials, and skilled labor, which will push up costs. And you already have this balancing act, of course, between input costs and profits. There will be scarcity in added production costs for some key materials. Now, we went through, a decade ago, we were into high material costs. Now there's been really a depression in some of the resource costs, but I imagine that some of these will not stay down there. Nickel, copper, for example, they are relatively rare throughout the world, so they will come back up. And we will have higher energy costs because we have higher marginal costs for green power, and we will have higher input prices for other forms of power. Just to remind you, we're not just talking about shiny new buildings here. In any country, really, the proportion of the total building stock, the proportion of new buildings each year is only about 2 or 3 or 4%. And I'll show that in the white square there. This is just order of magnitude. And of course, certified buildings are a small part usually of new buildings. So we really have to think hard about how to deal with performance retrofits of the existing building sector. So a little summary. We're getting equipment and buildings improving in performance. By the way, a little sidebar, everyone loves the term sustainable building. Well, there isn't any such thing as a sustainable building. But there is sustainability, and high-performance buildings can help us move towards there. The US Department of Energy realized this 10 years ago and stopped talking about green buildings or sustainable. They only talk about high-performance buildings, which is a very logical thing to do. But we're going to have a demand for more buildings, more space per person, and that has been a problem. This is the demand problem because people want bigger rooms, they want their own flats, etc. And that wipes out the efficiency gains, what the economists call the rebound effect. We have policy ideas and technologies to make vast improvements, but it's not yet clear that we will. Does that 2 minutes and 55 seconds mean that that's what I have left or what I've done? Oh well. Here's a little summary I put together. Climate change drives storms and storm surges, riverine flooding, sea level rise, drought, ambient temperature, forest fires. That leads to flood and wind property destruction, mortality and health problems, climate refugees, disruption of basic services, insect migration. That's an interesting one. And then we have demand, which increases, especially in Asia. Resource depletion, which will come back, and water. I haven't even talked about water scarcity, but of course in some areas it's a huge issue. And anyway, so what will this lead to? Probably relocation. And I heard talk about Istanbul. How would you like to move 15 million people somewhere else? I wouldn't. Repair needs. Need for more cooling power and need for new construction. That's a little summary. Then we have wildcard events like earthquakes, volcanoes, pandemics, etc. So that's a full menu for my younger colleagues to handle in the next couple of decades. And frankly, it's a big, big, big job. One thing I threw in here at the end because it's useful so one doesn't get too despondent. Some of these measures that you need to take to enact have very good payback. They are very profitable to do, whereas some of the other ones over here to the right are quite costly and don't have a good payback. But there are measures with good payback available. What do we need to do? Education, that's investors, brokers, designers, everywhere aware of the issues. Training, Designers and operators have to know the techniques for doing efficient and effective design. Have to monitor performance. It's hard to tell people to improve the performance of their buildings if we don't have a baseline, a reference of what their building type should perform to. So if you say mid-rise office buildings in the Istanbul region, you need a reference value for what is considered good performance and best performance for that building type. Mitigation. Not designing or constructing, that's a good one. Building more efficiently, minimizing use of equipment and appliances, ensuring that new buildings have net zero or nearly zero emissions. The Europeans are now talking much more about nearly zero because they're a little more realistic. I think they looked at net zero and by the way, net zero is only operating the way people talk about it. The only meaningful thing is to talk about zero life cycle performance. But that means integrating the embodied energy and emissions with the operating. Renovation we have to focus on. We have to ensure that building operators are well trained. I visited a very large housing project in Canada once, 10 years ago, and he had charts of energy consumption on the wall, and 4 years before, there was a big spike, went up like this, energy consumption, and then it gradually started to go down. And I said, what happened there? And he said, our building operator retired, and we had to get somebody new. He didn't know the systems. So, you know, it's not just the equipment. You all know this. Adaptation. Not building on sites that are vulnerable. And, you know, people still do it near forest fire areas, near flooding areas. They love it. They're all masochists. And what can you do? So we have to be ready to relocate large populations and their infrastructure. The Vancouver airport, the operations control room for Vancouver airport is even now below sea level. Well, it's easier than moving Istanbul, but I wouldn't either like to have the job of moving Vancouver International Airport. That's a huge job. We have to do repair and reconstruction, adapt our buildings and infrastructure, aim for zero operating, but we have to make sure that we have to reduce the emissions much more rapidly, rapid reduction, because those emissions stay around for at least 100 years in the air, in the atmosphere at least, and the sea level rise goes on for 1,000 years. The CO2 we put in this year will cause sea level rise for the next 1,000 years. So we really have to tackle that basic problem first. Now, I think I said I was going to talk about the conference series. Yes, this is something that our organization does in cooperation, in partnership with CIB, which a lot of you know. They've been around for a long time. Research agencies belong to CIB. FIDIC is a huge international organization for consulting engineering firms, and UNEP SBCI in Paris. And so we have teamed together to, well, at first it was CIB and ISB 10 years ago, but now we have all four involved, and in fact WGBC are observers this round. This has been going since the year 2000. It's a 3-year cycle now with national conferences on year 2 and global ones in year 3. Next year is 20, I've lost count, 19 or 20 national conferences. And then there's Hong Kong in 2017. All of these conferences have peer-reviewed papers and then present regional policy papers and display evaluated projects and so on. And the global ones include some of the best papers from the national events. And, well, you can see it's a list of all the ones for next year, and I put a box around Turkey. Istanbul is in. We're very, very happy to see that, because Turkey, we know, is hugely important, and we really want to do all we can to help IMSAD and their partners make a really fine job of this conference coming up. So, because we think that'll have a big influence. I mean, Turkey in itself is very important, but also, as others were saying, this export drive really gives you influence beyond your borders. We've asked the organizers of all of them for a bit of speaking time to provide some highlights from COP21 in Paris, to link those decisions to the series. That's it. Thank you.